Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate. Just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
I dated an alcoholic. I was an alcoholic, so was my ex. But that together, that's tough. You know, she was a worse drunk than me. She had one of those cars that only started when she blew the guy in the seat next to her. It's a joke. It's a joke.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Wiker Saturday, September the 21st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, ideas have consequences, grow up, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the 10 books every conservative must read. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
See him arrive. He stood 6'6", weighed 245, kinda broad at the shoulder, narrow at the hip, and everybody knew you didn't give no lip to Big John. Big John, Big John, Big Bad John. Big John. Well, nobody seemed to know when John called home. He just drifted into town and stayed all alone. Didn't say much. Kind of quiet and shy, and if he spoke at all, he just said hi to Big John. Somebody said he came from New Orleans, where he got into a fight over a Cajun queen, and a crashing blow from a huge right hand sent a Louisiana fella to the promised land. Big John, come on. Big John, Big John, Big miners were praying and hearts beat fast, and everybody thought they'd breathe their last. Except John. Big John. Big John. Sagging timber gave out with a groan, and like a giant oak tree, he stood there alone. Big John. Big John. Big John. Big bad John. Oh, and with all of his strength, he gave a mighty shove. Then a miner yelled out, "There's a light above us." And his 20 men scrambled from a would-be grave. There was only one left down there to save. Big John, Big John, Big John, Big John, Big John, Big John. With jacks and timbers, they started back down. Then came that rumble way down in the ground, and as smoke and gas belched out of that mine, everybody knew it was the end of the line for John. Now they never reopened that worthless pit. They just placed a marble slab in front of it. And these few words are written on that stand. At the bottom of this mine lies a big, big man. Big John, Big John, Big bad John. Big John, Big John, Big bad John, Big John.
Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
At the heart of capitalism is the unification of knowledge and power. Because knowledge is dispersed, power must be as well. George Gilder. Here, Gilder simply applies the brilliance of Hayek's knowledge problem in the most succinct possible way. Trying to centralize knowledge, as the collectivist does, creates horrifically suboptimal economic outcomes. Trying to centralize power, though, creates destruction.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
To provide and maintain a navy. To make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by cession of particular states in the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. That last line is where we, the devil in the details, came in. Article 2 is all about the executive branch. That's the president to you. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He also gets to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. Plus, he gets to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. The end. Article 3, the judicial branch, is even shorter. Here's basically all you need to know. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall at stated times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. Couldn't be simpler, really. And what are the Supreme Court's actual enumerated powers, you ask? Turns out, almost none. Tell that to learned hand. The judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made or which shall be made under their authority. To all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls. To all cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction. To controversies to which the United States shall be a party. To controversies between two or more states. Between a state and citizens of another state. Between citizens of different states. Between citizens of the same state claiming lands under grants of different states. And between a state or the citizens thereof and foreign states, citizens, or subjects. This was modified slightly by the 11th Amendment with some babble about lawsuits commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. But otherwise, that's about it. Not a word about abortion, which continues to puzzle me since I was raised thinking that a woman's right to choose was as fundamental a cornerstone to this almost great republic as Plymouth Rock. The rest of the Constitution is boilerplate stuff about the relationships of the states, how the feds guarantee each state a Republican form of government, which I didn't like the sound of at all until one of my professors at Columbia explained to me the archaic meaning of the term, the amendment process, debts, oath, supremacy, ratification, and then it was signed, sealed, and delivered, and the rap party began, until somebody said, "Hey, wait a minute." And so the Bill of Rights was born. Those are the first 10 amendments to you, and they have caused our side no end of grief since. In fact, it's safe to say that we are now pretty much at war with all of them, including the once sacred First Amendment, behind which we hid for decades. You know all about the Big Ten, so there's no need to go into detail here, except to observe their blunt language, which basically amounts to saying to the nascent Hercules in his cradle, no. First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
And that was Rules for Radicals, Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. More next week. Back in a minute. Thank you. So more from the book Grow Up, and we're working backwards. So we started with Rule 20, then Rule 19, and this time Rule 18.
Was it helpful or hurtful? To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that that prisoner was you. Lewis Smedes. Self-destruction. What are you doing? Is it helping or is it destroying you? For the most part, we blindly assume that whatever we're doing is helping us. No one wants to admit that our choices of attitude and action can be akin to intentionally choosing to destroy ourselves. There's a word for this phenomenon. It's called denial. We rationalize and justify our actions. We give reasons and excuses. We tell ourselves and others that what we do is no big deal. We have it under control. We even convince ourselves that harmful behavior is actually helpful. That lie we told, well, it preserved a relationship. That stuff we're smoking, well, it's medicinal. That drink, well, it opened doors for a business deal. Addiction, no way. DUI, you're crazy. Deception, well, it made us all feel better. We tell ourselves that none of this hurts us, but have we stopped to weigh the cost of those decisions? Sometimes what seems helpful to us at the time is really nothing more than thinly veiled incremental destruction of our soul. Bitterness, anger, and unforgiveness, these are things that fall into that category. A decade of wasted years. A pastor friend of mine once shared a story with me. The story was a personal one that he'd lived and one from which he had learned a valuable lesson. Unfortunately, more than a decade passed before he realized it and addressed the problem. As a teenager, his father had left his mother for another woman. He never knew all the details, but from his vantage point, he knew all he needed to know. As a young man, he harbored bitterness toward the woman that became his stepmother, holding tight to his anger for nearly 13 years. Every time he was around her, every time he saw her, he let her know how he felt. He was angry, and he was bitter, and he showed his disdain for her at every turn. He was helping himself by not allowing himself to be a victim, or at least so he thought. If her name came up in conversation, he made sure everyone knew his thoughts about her. These conversations always ended abruptly. He pulled no punches. He hated her and would never forgive her. He blamed her for hurting him, and he felt that his unforgiveness toward her was justified and even helpful closure. Years later, he came to understand the damage he was causing to his own heart, mind, and soul. For 13 years, he held on to his rage and left a trail of broken relationships in his wake. Friendships were made and eventually shattered. Dating relationships were destined to implode. The only question was how long they would last before collapsing under the heavy weight of his righteous indignation. In his late 20s, he came to the point of taking an honest look at himself. What he saw didn't look healthy. In fact, it looked sick and diseased. Something was wrong. His anger and resentment affected every area of his life. An emotional cancer was consuming every organ of his body, but first and foremost, his heart, his mind, and his soul. Something had him shackled, and until those chains were broken, his life would continue to unravel.
And that was the first part of Lesson 18 from Grow Up. Life Isn't Safe, but It's Good by Dr. Everett Piper. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now some more of Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver.
In a wonderfully prescient passage, Burke foretold the results of such positivism when it was first unleashed by the French Revolution. All the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal, which harmonized the different shades of life, and which, by a bland assimilation, incorporated into politics the sentiments which beautify and soften private society, are to be dissolved by this new conquering empire of light and reason. All the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off. All the superadded ideas furnished from the wardrobe of a moral imagination, which the heart owns and the understanding ratifies, as necessary to cover the defects of our naked, shivering nature, and to raise it to dignity in our own estimation, are to be exploded as a ridiculous, absurd, and antiquated fashion. Barbarism and Philistinism cannot see that knowledge of material reality is a knowledge of death. The desire to get even closer to the source of physical sensation. This is the downward pull which puts an end to ideational life. No education is worthy of the name which fails to make the point that the world is best understood from a certain distance, or that the most elementary understanding requires a degree of abstraction. To insist on less is to merge ourselves with the exterior reality, or to capitulate to the endless induction of empiricism. Our age provides many examples of the ravages of immediacy, the clearest of which is the failure of the modern mind to recognize obscenity. This failure is not connected with the decay of Puritanism. The word is employed here in its original sense to describe that which should be enacted off stage because it is unfit for public exhibition. Such actions, it must be emphasized, may have no relation to gross animal functions. They include intense suffering and humiliation, which the Greeks, with habitual perspicacity and humanity, banned from their theater. The Elizabethans, on the other hand, with their robust allusions to the animal conditions of man's existence, were nonetheless not obscene. It is all in the way one touches this subject. This failure of the concept of obscenity has been concurrent with the rise of the institution of publicity, which, ever seeking to widen its field in accordance with the canon of progress, makes a virtue of desecration. In the 19th century, this change came visibly over the world, bringing expressions of concern from people who had been brought up in the tradition of proper sentiment. Propriety, like other old-fashioned anchorages, was abandoned because it inhibited something. Proud of its shamelessness, the new journalism served up in swaggering style matter which heretofore had been veiled in decent taciturnity. It was natural that so true an apostle of culture as Matthew Arnold should have sensed the mortal enemy in this. After a tour of the United States in 1888, he recorded his conviction that if one was searching for the best means to efface and kill in a whole nation the discipline of self-respect, the feeling for what is elevated, he could do no better than take the American newspapers. Is this why, 200 years before, a governor of Virginia had thanked God, to the scandal of succeeding generations, that there was not a newspaper in the colony? Have we here another example of the evil discerned most clearly on its first appearance? What he beheld in germ has grown so immeasurably that today we have media of publicity which actually specialize in the kind of obscenity which the cultivated, not the prurient, find repugnant, and which the wisest of the ancients forbade. In any case, it has been left to the world of science and rationalism to make a business of purveying of the private and the offensive. Picture magazines and tabloid newspapers place before the millions scenes and facts which violate every definition of humanity. How common is it today to see upon the front page of some organ destined for 100,000 homes the agonized face of a child run over in the street, the dying expression of a woman crushed by a subway train, tableaus of execution, scenes of intense private grief. These are the obscenities. The rise of sensational journalism everywhere testifies to man's loss of points of reference, to his determination to enjoy the forbidden in the name of freedom.
And that was the next part of Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. And this is, I believe, chapter 4. And next week, probably the conclusion of this chapter. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
Living without restriction. The unrestricted person who has in hand what they will in all events is free. But anyone who can be restricted, coerced, or pushed into something against what they will is a slave. Epictetus, Discourses, 4.1.128b through 129a. Take a look at some of the most powerful, rich, and famous people in the world. Ignore the trappings of their success and what they are able to buy. Look instead at what they're forced to trade in return. Look at what success has cost them. Mostly, freedom. Their work demands they wear a suit. Their success depends on attending certain parties, kissing up to people they don't like. It will require, inevitably, realizing they are unable to say what they actually think. Worse, it demands that they become a different type of person or do bad things. Sure, it may pay well, but they haven't truly examined the transaction. As Seneca put it, slavery resides under marble and gold. Too many successful people are prisoners in jails of their own making. Is that what you want? Is that what you're working hard toward? Let's hope not.
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. And now, a little bit of meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Okay, politics and religion, stay away from those if you want to stay away from a fight. The woke culture has certainly exacerbated the situation because everybody is on eggshells. You know, it's like walking through an ideological minefield every time we open our mouths that we're going to be offending somebody. And then religion, are you kidding? Is one of the most volatile topics to bring up. So I do get that, you know, we're just afraid to say even that we're Christians. Well, the trouble is you just can't accept that scenario as a Christian because it's essential to our lives that we evangelize. You know, as Paul says, I mean, woe to me if I do not evangelize. Well, that's true of every baptized person. We're all prophets. We're commissioned to announce the gospel.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day.
Should husbands and wives tally up at the end of the day and say, well, now, wait a minute. I love her if she's done enough for me today, or she loves me if I have properly performed my functions?
No, you misunderstood me. That is not how love should be treated. I agree with you that it should be treated like a business deal, but every business has to have its own terms and its own kind of currency. And in love, the currency is virtue. You love people, not for what you do for them or what they do for you. You love them for the values, the virtues which they have achieved in their own character. You don't love causelessly. You don't love everybody indiscriminately. You love only those who deserve it.
And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the 33 strategies of war.
From Julius Caesar by J.F.C. Fuller. In this postscript on the solution of Caesar's problem, it is not our intention to trace Octavian's rise to power from the time he arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance until in 31 B.C., with the aid of Vipsanius Agrippa, he defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium and became master of the Roman world. Instead, it is to describe in brief how as such he solved Caesar's problem and established a peace which was to last for over 200 years. When he contemplated the empire he had won and its heterogeneous local governments and peoples, he realized that it was far too large and complex to be ruled by the council of a city-state, that instead it demanded some form of one-man rule, and that his problem was how to disguise it. From the outset, he decided not to tamper with the constitution of the republic or contemplate monarchy. Firstly, in 28 BC, he declined all honors calculated to remind the Romans of the kingly power, adopted the title of princeps, first citizen, and called his system the Principate. Secondly, he accepted all the old conventions, consuls, tribunes, magistrates, elections, etc. Thirdly, instead of ignoring the Senate and insulting its members as Caesar had done, he went out of his way to consult it and placate them. Lastly, on January 13th, 27 BC, at a session of the Senate, he renounced all his extraordinary powers and placed them at the disposal of the Senate and the people. And when the senators begged him to resume them and not to abandon the commonwealth he had saved, he yielded to their request and consented to assume proconsular authority over an enlarged province which included Spain, Gaul, Syria, Cilicia, and Cyprus, while the Senate was left with the remaining provinces. Thus, in semblance, the sovereignty of the Senate and the people was restored. But in fact, because his enlarged province comprised the majority of the legions and Egypt, over which he ruled as king, the basis of political power passed into his hands. 3 days later, the Senate decreed that the title Augustus, the revered, should be conferred upon him.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War. Back in a minute. Thank you. And if you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because psychological internalization is one of the central topological shifts of violence in modernity. Violence occurs in the form of a conflict within the psyche. Destructive tensions are born internally rather than discharged externally. The front is no longer located outside the ego, but within it. Civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it like a garrison in a conquered city. Back in a minute.
Barbara was also falling apart during this time, unable to reconcile her intellectual devotion to Rand's philosophy, which affirmed the affair, with her very human revulsion at what seemed self-serving hypocrisy and a violation of the essence of marriage. Always the compassionate one, Ayn would spend hours with Barbara trying to help her work through her irrational feelings and moral defects. One night, while disconsolately walking the streets as Ayn and Nathaniel were enjoying each other's embrace, Barbara called Rand, begging to come over to the apartment and talk. Rand exploded into the phone. "How dare you? Do you think only of yourself? Am I completely invisible to you? I don't ask anyone for help. There's your whole problem in the fact that you called. If you want something, that's all you know or care about. Don't dare dream of coming here." As readers of her biography will find out on page after page, such narcissistic treatment of everyone, but especially her own disciples, was typical of Rand. She exalted rationality. She believed that she had forged the rational philosophy entirely by herself, overlooked by the entire history of philosophers, save a few good bits of logic in Aristotle. Indeed, she believed herself to be the manifestation of rationality.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. So it's peculiar. This is really peculiar. Throughout his book, the 10 books every conservative must read, plus 4 not to miss and 1 imposter, and this one is supposed to be the imposter, he actually reviews the books. He starts with a biography, an unnecessary biography of the authors, of the authors, and then goes ahead and proceeds to review the book. And here, there's only like eight minutes left of this, and it's obvious he's never, ever going to get to reviewing Atlas Shrugged, because you can't review it in 8 minutes out of a 30-minute 30 minutes that this section contains. There's no way that the last 8 minutes are going to be any type of accurate and reasonable and thoughtful criticism or critique of Atlas Shrugged. All this has been so far is a hit piece on Ayn Rand. And this is what people seem to do, I've noticed. This is a pattern. When people cannot assail ideas intellectually, then what they do is they resort to psychology and sociability. So that's what he does. And basically, it's a root cause again. He uses socialist techniques, and he goes and wants to find out what is the root cause of Ayn Rand's psychosis and unsociability, because that's the other big sin on the left, is being unsocial. So he goes back into her childhood, and that's the way the left does things, is that they always find a way to go into the psychological realm, and then in the that's why they like to ask why. Well, why? Why do you feel that way? And then when you start to give an explanation, the only reason you can give for why you feel some certain way is a pseudo-psychological reason. So then they go into your past. They go to your childhood. They're going to want to explore that because that's the root cause of you psychologically. So, and then this is a good way for them to not deal with and ignore the intellectual issues that you may have brought up. And in this particular case, the intellectual issues Ayn Rand has brought up. So, Ayn Rand was wrong about many things, but she was brilliant, absolutely brilliant woman. I do quotes from her every day, and the things that I've read from her books that were written in the 1960s still apply today, 70 or 50, 60, 70 years later. So she was absolutely brilliant. She made some fundamental mistakes. As soon as she created objectivism as a philosophy, which there is no such thing, by the way, or her philosophy, which again, there's no such thing. There's not my philosophy, your philosophy, just philosophy. Now, she can call it a philosophical theory if she'd like, fine. But when she created objectivism, she ceased to be objective. What she should have done was not promote objectivism, but promote objectivity. Also, when she created objectivism, she started on the path of trying to create a perfect society. She went left. That's the fundamental difference between right and left, sociopolitically, is that the left, everybody on the left is looking for a perfect society. The only thing that differentiates them is what kind of perfect society they're looking for. Socialists want the perfect social society, libertarians want the perfectly liberal society, and objectivists want the perfectly rational society. And again, if she had merely promoted objectivity instead of objectivism, she wouldn't have gone wrong there. So that's a legitimate intellectual criticism of her work. But to go in and talk about who it is that she had slept with or had an affairs with, and again, on a biography written by who? An official biographer? Was it an autobiography? So again, it seems to me that a lot of these claims, because I've heard them before, by the way, are arbitrary, and in any case, they're off the mark. They're irrelevant, immaterial, and prejudicial. Back in a minute. And I wanted to add here on this that if you really want to get an appreciation for Ayn Rand and what a brilliant woman she was, skip her fiction works. Everybody wants to talk about, when they talk about Ayn Rand, her fiction, the two big books, Fountainhead, which I have read, and Atlas Shrugged, which I have not. But if you really want to get an understanding of how brilliant she was, stick to her nonfiction work. The first one I would suggest is Philosophy, Who Needs It? Chapter 1. If you can't be bothered to read the whole book, read Chapter 1 of Philosophy, Who Needs It? She also did the one on capitalism, The Unknown Ideal, and the Romantic Manifesto, which is about art. But she had many different, the Voice of Reason was another one, and then there's also books by Leonard Peikoff about objectivism, like Objectivist Epistemology, etc. And those are well worth reading because, again, that's where her real brilliance shines through. Back. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.